Well, I want to welcome everyone who's joining our EPIC webinar today. Thanks for taking the time. I'm Ken Thorpe. I'm the chairman of the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease, a coalition of multiple stakeholders in the healthcare marketplace, focusing on prevention, earlier detection of, and more effective management of chronic healthcare conditions. I'm also a professor of health policy at Emory University in Atlanta. Common chronic diseases like arthritis, diabetes, asthma, depression, and heart disease affect 50% of people in America. Among the Medicare population, those numbers are even higher. More than half of those covered by Medicare have 3 or more chronic healthcare conditions. Managing those conditions and preventing others from developing them is critical to enhancing health, avoiding disability, premature death, and towering healthcare costs. Most people use a variety of prescription medications and medicines to manage these conditions. Indeed, the 2 real keys to keeping healthcare costs down are effective medication therapy and good primary care. Those are what if you look at medications that are pills, pills, patches, inhalers, syrups, and other forms of medicines, that's what are called small molecule medicines. Others, like infusions, IV injections, and related therapy, typically administered in a doctor's office, are biologics. They are complex medications that require special handling, like cold storage, and precise dosing and administration that requires healthcare providers' assistance. The Inflation Reduction Act subjects both types of medicines to Medicare pricing authority, but specifies different timelines: 9 years for small molecule medicines and 13 years for biologics after the drugs get FDA approval. Many have raised concern about the implications of this difference in timelines and what it'll have in terms of the incentives for investing in small molecule medications. That's what really led to the introduction of the Ensuring Pathways to Innovative Cures, or EPIC Act, HR 7174. EPIC addresses this disincentive to R&D for small molecules by equalizing the timeline for Medicare drug pricing to be the same as the IRA sets for biologic therapies, 13 years from FDA first approval to notice of pricing implementation. The EPIC Act was introduced at the end of January and is a bipartisan effort. The bill is co-sponsored jointly by Representatives Greg Murphy of North Carolina, Don Davis of North Carolina, and Brett Guthrie of Kentucky. McLean Pine, the legislative director for Congressman Murphy, asked that I share this following statement with you. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a few remarks in support of the EPIC Act. This bipartisan legislation solves the IRA's unintended small molecule pill penalty by equalizing the playing field, ensuring continued investments into small molecule medicines. These are critical therapies that many Americans with cancer, neurological conditions, and chronic conditions rely on every day. I want to thank the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease and all the advocates here today for their leadership on behalf of patients. Maintaining access to these life-saving therapies is critical to advancing the health and well-being of all Americans. On the bill's introduction, his North Carolina colleague and co-sponsor, Congressman Don Davis, added, "We must support the development of critical life-sustaining medical treatments and cures. Access to high-quality, innovative healthcare must remain in reach for most vulnerable patients." Congressman Murphy and Davis are joined on the EPIC Act by Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee Chair Brett Guthrie, who has stated, "Congress should be incentivizing investments in developing of cutting-edge therapies, not penalizing innovators for helping drive real change in our healthcare system. The EPIC Act will ensure these life-saving products reach patients without picking winners and losers like the Inflation Reduction Act currently does. I'm proud to lead this bipartisan bill along with Congressman Murphy and Davis. Look forward to working with my colleagues toward advancing this bill. Now to our panelists. We have a group here that knows a lot about these issues and will help us understand what's at stake. It's my pleasure to introduce first Dr. Gary Puckrein, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Minority Quality Forum, a not-for-profit organization that he founded in 1998. The forum addresses the critical need for strengthening national and local efforts to use evidence-based, data-driven initiatives to guide programs to eliminate the disproportionate burden of premature death and preventable illness for racial and ethnic minorities and for other special populations. Also joining us is Epsita Smolinski, who is a veteran advisor in healthcare, regulatory, and legislative issues with over 20 years of experience in healthcare policy and economic analysis. As Managing Director of Capitol Street, she advises clients on key trends and major actions coming out of Washington, D.C., as well at the state, court, and stakeholder levels. We're also thrilled to have Gordon Levine with us today. Gordon joined the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance as a CEO November 2020. In this role, Gordon leads the Alliance's efforts to achieve a coordinated system of care that addresses all aspects of schizophrenia, promote basic understanding that the disease is a no-fault one, that can be successfully treated, and support the development of new, more effective treatments without the debilitating side effect of current therapies. Thank you all for being here today to help us better understand some of the complexities of the IRA's impact on innovation and access to medicines. I'm going to kick off our discussion with some questions, but also welcome for you, those in the audience, to use the chat QA feature to submit questions of your own at any point during the conversation. So Gordon, let me start with you. One of the major goals of the Alliance is to raise awareness about schizophrenia being a no-fault brain-driven disease that can be successfully treated. What role do small molecule medicines currently play in the treatment of schizophrenia? And what about other neurological diseases affecting the brain?
Thank you, Ken, for the opportunity to participate, and also the other panelists for your role in your advocacy on this important issue. So the mission of the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance is to lead the charge for transformative change, fostering recovery for the millions of individuals affected by schizophrenia and related psychosis spectrum disorders in the United States and beyond. We do this through research, advocacy, education, and care support. One of the things that we strongly advocate for, and that cuts across all of our work, is that we believe people with schizophrenia have the right to early detection, effective treatment, and an opportunity to contribute their strengths and skills with society, just like everyone else. This is a serious neuropsychiatric brain disease that can significantly alter people's experience of reality, and they face many challenges in the community, in their families, in terms of being able to live independently, in terms of being able to interact in a social way with friends, dating, falling in love. So there are many, many barriers to effective treatment and care for our community. So we want to advocate in support of removing any barriers that exist so that we can promote lifelong treatment and proper support so that people with schizophrenia can not only live, but they can thrive. The existing treatment paradigm for schizophrenia is typically antipsychotic medication, and these are small molecules. And the way that they are able to cross the blood-brain barrier is the standard of care, in addition to some other wraparound supports. So it's paramount that these innovative treatments are always available. One of the realities that we have learned from our community is that existing therapeutic options typically have a variety of side effect profiles that are debilitating, things like weight gain and many other debilitating side effects. So the need for innovation for new treatments is incredibly important. So the framing of removing barriers is something that you're going to hear throughout comments today and anyone that you interact with within our community.
Okay, Gordon, thanks for that. And thanks for your leadership on this issue. Gary, the Partnership to Fight Chronic Disease released a study in 2022 that estimated that the additional medical costs associated with disparities in the level of disease control amount to $471 billion over 10 years. And that's just for people already diagnosed. So what should we be doing better to help people diagnosed with chronic illness achieve recommended health targets, and how do medicines factor into those efforts?
So first, I want to join Gordon in thanking you, Ken, and other panelists for the opportunity to present this afternoon. The issue of inequities in the healthcare system is a long-standing one. And frequently, as we pass new legislation, it only exacerbates the problem because as new legislations are being passed, they're not in scope and trying to understand the impact of these changes. Let's be specific. There's a demographic shift occurring in the United States. If you look at California, New Mexico, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, these are all states that are becoming majority-minority states. And historically, the minority community, African American, Hispanic, Native American, Asians, have been underserved in these communities. And certainly, public policy has contributed to that underserving. They're also not in the clinical studies. And so we need to get them into the clinical studies. We need the innovative therapies. So when you begin to set up laws that discourage innovation, it is necessarily going to have an impact on those communities. When you look at the data, they probably have more access to small molecule medications, to biologics and infusions. You look at the rural community, the use of small molecules are probably more important than infusion therapies because you have to get to a physician's office and we're closing down rural hospitals. So the sum of this is to increase risk. And one of the things that we look at when we think about public policy is, does it increase or decrease risk for patients? And by risk, I'm talking about risk for hospitalization, risk for emergency room visits, risk for disability, risk for mortality, while improving the quality of their life. And the challenge that has happened here is that that sort of risk mitigation for patients has not occurred. Financial risk mitigation is certainly at play, but I have to underscore that financial risk mitigation is not healthcare. It's not healthcare. All right, healthcare is about taking care of patients. And so when we look at these new legislations, we look at them from that lens, and we have deep concerns. And those concerns have not been answered. What is going to happen to patients? Are we elevating their risk or not elevating their risk? And we already know when we look at minority and underserved communities, they have higher risk. We say your zip code is more important than your genetic code for life expectancy. And the reason why that is because the way in which we are provisioning healthcare. So, that is our concern. Is this going to have a deep effect on these communities?
Well, Garrett, thanks for those insights. And as always, it's a pleasure to work with you. And I look forward to continue to work with you in the future as well. Ipsita, another longstanding colleague of mine. The CBO and other experts agree that the Medicare drug pricing effort will reduce the number of new drugs available to patients. Indeed, if you just look at the dramatic reduction in venture capital funding that's happened over the last year, you'll see that the money available to help finance drug development has gone down quite sharply. So certainly the investment community is quite skeptical about the impact this is going to have on drugs. Another aspect that's less discussed are the types of drugs that are likely to be impacted. In what ways does the IRA impact different types of drugs and the incentives to invest in the research and development?
Thanks for the question, Ken, and thanks for putting together this panel. Yeah, I mean, CBO, Congress's accountant, has put together estimates for what negotiation does for innovation, along with cost estimates and projections, et cetera, and essentially saying about a dozen fewer over 30 years, 30 years. So 1 over the next 10 years, 5, 7 for the subsequent decade, and then decade after that. They have said that they will, CBO that is, will look at what the more specifics may be on small molecules and various therapeutic classes, large molecules, and that's TBD. They also project that prices will be cut by about 50%, 50. I think the reality is that they'll probably have various discounts depending on the product and depending on the exercise they're going through right now with manufacturers, et cetera. But I think, to get to your point with investment, the math that they used, and they described their math, was really a look at, I would say that it didn't consider venture investing in that early stage. And if they estimate that it costs, something like $2 billion to develop a new drug, but it's going to cut revenues by another X billion dollars, and they do the math and they come up with these numbers. But the reality is, if you're wearing an investor hat, you start by wanting to put 50 million or 100 million or 200 million into something that would hopefully be 6x that, and won't necessarily do that if revenues are going to be capped potentially at 9 years. So I think that was a potential miss as far as the math in doing those CBO projections. But again, they've mentioned that they want to get this right and have asked for data, and we'll put out some subsequent analyses. And then the other thing I would say is that revenues for drugs aren't necessarily linear. And my other panelists may be able to speak to this as well if they want to. Most of I shouldn't say most, but about half of revenues really come between that 9-year and 14-year mark. So if you cut it off at 9, then you're kind of reducing revenues by closer to half versus 1/3. So we all know it takes time for drugs to be approved and covered by payers and for physicians to understand what they are. So that takes time, months and years, for drugs to be prescribed and paid for and reimbursed. So those are a couple of things that I would point out.
No, thanks. Thanks for those insights.
If I may, Ken.
We're all glad that CBO is taking another look at this, because had they talked to the venture capital community, I think that they may have come up with some different views of it.
Ken, so I'm not an economist. I took one eco class when I was a freshman, and that was probably enough for me. But the one thing I did pick up in that eco class is government price controls are not a good thing. I've never heard of government price controls being a good thing. And I always ask my health economist friends, why is government price control a good thing in healthcare? And in other sectors of the economy, it is not. And I've never gotten an answer to that question. I continue to raise the question whether government price controls are a smart thing to do in healthcare, because I remember from that eco cost, it creates shortages, it creates disinvestment. No place did I hear coming out of that that somehow society benefits from it. And the challenge with healthcare is that there's another side of the equation, which is health. And so when you push down on the price control lever, you elevate the risk lever for patients. It is not a pass. It is not a free thing. And I don't get it. I'm being honest, and maybe I'm just dumb and somebody else has got a better answer than me. And so I'm putting it out there. Help me understand how government price controls make sense in healthcare.
Well, the short answer is they don't. And I think the disappointing part of this, the Inflation Reduction Act, is that other policy options that would really have reformed the nature of drug pricing, looking at the role that middlemen play, looking at the role that pharmacy benefit managers play, like many state Medicaid programs have done, in terms of essentially sending all the rebates directly to patients at the pharmacy counter. And states that have done this have found that they're lowering drugs across the board by about 15% without having the deleterious effects on innovation that we're talking about here today. So there were other options and other approaches that are currently being discussed right now in the Congress. And we're hoping that those move forward, but that broader discussion just was not held last year. So Gordon, let's return back to you. So we've been talking a lot about innovation, and PFCD was just talking about it as well. I understand that a key focus of the Alliance is the search for treatments that are both more effective and avoid the debilitating side effects associated with many current treatments for schizophrenia. What are some of those unmet medical needs for which innovation is needed, and how would the EPIC Act impact that?
The list is much longer than we have time for, unfortunately, in this webinar for people living with schizophrenia and psychosis. Our organization thinks of this in a total economic impact perspective. What is the price we're willing to pay for allowing untreated schizophrenia and psychosis to continue? The potential negative impacts of lack of finding a clinician easily, lack of getting a proper diagnosis. Once you find a clinician and you get a proper diagnosis, finding a treatment option that actually works for you is very challenging, given many debilitating side effects with existing treatment options. So these side effects and untreated schizophrenia, generally speaking, have the impact of making it almost impossible for some to participate within society, to hold a job, to cook dinner for yourself, to live independently. Those are the stories we hear when people call our helpline or in our support groups. The ability to find a medicine that actually works for you is, like I said, very challenging. So what ends up happening is this cascade of switching. And the number of switching examples that takes place is more than we should tolerate, because all of that time means there's untreated disease progression taking place. And that progression and transition from one therapeutic to another also means that you're dealing with the ramp up or the ramp downs. So we need to find new options that allow a stronger degree of adherence, less switching, and less side effects. The only way to do that is to bring new innovative options to the market for this community. We don't have 4 years, the difference between 9 and 13. We barely have seconds to interact with, because for every second of untreated schizophrenia and psychosis, there's brain impairment that can take place. So we don't think of this in 4 or 5 year horizons. We think of this in every second matters. What can we do to accelerate that period of time for people to get the proper therapeutic interventions that are required so that they can get back to their job, get back to school, do the things that they love, and that allow them to function fully within society. We think people with schizophrenia want to recover, and they deserve those options in order to do so.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Gordon. Gary, you're a huge proponent of letting data drive policy decisions. We know that access is a major issue for millions of Americans. People may have to travel an hour or more just to reach a doctor's office, and physician-administered drugs means multiple trips. Those logistics present challenges for everyone, but particularly so for people living with disabilities and their care partners. How do these factors impact health outcomes and disparities, and what difference would the EPIC Act make?
You know, one of the things that I've had the good fortune to do over the years is to go into underserved communities and sit and listen to people as they struggle with cancer and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and their sense of disappointment in how the system is provisioning care to them. And this goes back to my original point that what we ought to expect out of our healthcare system is that every day it is fighting for the patient to mitigate their risk for poor health outcome. No patient that I'm aware of goes into the healthcare system with the expectation that the system is going to elevate their risk for cancer. And what is so insidious about these policies is that the patient doesn't know. They don't understand what that decision was made on Capitol Hill that is now affecting their children's lives, their parents' lives, and they can't opt out. See, people of means may be able to opt out of that system and say, okay, I'm going to buy my way out. I'm going to be able to figure out how to travel. I'm going to be able to figure out my caregiver situation. And there's no consideration of that when these policies are put in place. And I think that's the challenge, because what the patient doesn't know is in that provider-patient interaction, when they're in there talking to their doctor, that there are a set of parameters that have been established that impact the decision-making that the physician has to make in order to provide some kind of care to those patients. And in that process, risk occurs. And we have to have a healthcare system that is being informed by the risk of the patient. We can't do this anymore because, in effect, what we're doing is we're pushing people back into the 20th century when we have the science and technology to take them into the 21st century. And so I'm always confused, to be honest with you, when these decisions are made and there's no sense that there's going to be impact on patients.
Well, I think that's, Gary, you raise an important point. The focus wasn't necessarily on patients in the Inflation Reduction Act. It was really largely generating savings to the Medicare program. But the focus, had it been on patients, would have really focused solely on what patients pay out of pocket. It's still too high, even with that $2,000 cap coming in next year. So the out-of-pocket component should have been the part that really drove in the legislation and drove the focus, but unfortunately it didn't.
Ken, I can't share for you more on that. When you look at that legislation, it is about financial risk mitigation, period. I mean, that's openly, that's what it's trying to do. Without thinking about the consequences. And what's important about the Medicare program it's a social insurance program, meaning everybody pays taxes into that. And so the janitor in the building pays the same fee as the president, right? I mean, they pay the same thing. But guess what? At the moment of care, the janitor is getting subpar care, and the president can opt out and go get what they need. That's the inequity in the program.
Yep, completely agree. So Ipsita, both Gordon and Gary have talked about the significant unmet needs that drive poor outcomes and create significant disparities in health outcomes and opportunities. When it comes to investing in R&D, are there certain areas of R&D where unmet medical needs are great, but the investment world views as just too risky? How are those decisions made? And would policy changes like the EPIC Act alter that dynamic for some research areas?
Yeah. So I would probably say there's two ways that you could see a reaction to the law overall. First, you have, of course, development programs and which clinical programs to pursue or not pursue. Also indications that could be pursued. So on the first development programs, you know, any therapies that are perhaps non-Medicare, immunology, you know, mental health, which of course is Medicare and non-pediatric, you know, some cynics would say that this law is really pushing R&D into those kind of non-Medicare type diseases, if you will. There's a huge number of development programs in cancer, for instance, that are in earlier line. So what that means is they get tested in a more refractory setting, third line, then second line, then first line. And so you might not start first line until like years later. Just to give an example in the oncology space. So, and then, you know, indications, again, we heard a CEO last summer at Genentech say, you know, it might not make financial sense to go into ovarian cancer. Prostate is a bigger indication, i.e. more of an ROI. You're not hearing that many executives and CEOs say those things anymore. And perhaps if you're a larger company, you can manage through some of this, but it's the smaller companies, it's the rare diseases, orphan indications, et cetera, that are really going to be a lot more impacted.
Nope, I absolutely agree. Let's talk a little bit more about the barriers to access for people with Medicare in managing chronic healthcare conditions. So let's circle back to Gordon. There's a tremendous amount of stigma associated with schizophrenia that serves as a major barrier to effective treatment. What role does the availability of treatments that can be picked up at a pharmacy or delivered by mail and taken at home play in breaking down some of these barriers to care associated with stigma and privacy concerns?
Yeah, we'd even elevate the word from stigma, which is valid, to something stronger, such as discrimination. And the conveniences of being able to pick it up or mail order, those are nice. And I think families and those diagnosed would appreciate those things. There's actually much bigger problems, which is the fact that society has, generally speaking, fairly low expectations for this community, which is really a horrible state of reality for us. You know, how much longer do we want to tolerate untreated schizophrenia and other forms of severe neuropsychiatric brain diseases to the effect of people on the streets, lack of adherence, lack of treatment options, incarceration, for some, attempted suicide. These are not outcomes that our country should be proud of, and our community deserves much, much better. And it brings up an example of a certain type of formulation, such as a long-acting injectable, which for many who have potential adherence challenges, the idea of an LAI is actually a really good idea because you don't have to obviously take the therapeutic as often, so it can be done in a more convenient way. So extended release, long-acting formulations of small molecule drugs, good idea, but it requires a new drug application from the FDA. And this usually happens much later in the drug's life cycle, right? Following an initial approval. And what is going to be that financial incentive for companies to invest so late in the life cycle of that drug to get that additional formulation? So we think that is maybe even a form of discrimination, that if for this population, our only option for the most part are small molecule drugs, and LAIs are a better path for dispensing, but there's not a financial incentive for companies to move in that direction, it's not a good outcome, potentially. So again, just to summarize, we need interventions when they matter most, not when the person's so dangerously ill that it leads to homelessness or incarceration or even worse outcomes. We can do much better, and it's beyond conveniences of mail order and things like that. It's really the whole financial model for how this population can be dispensed life-saving therapeutics.
Well, thanks for that insight. Well, Gary, the Medicare pricing program is intended to lower what Medicare pays for a drug at the end of the day. And proponents would argue that means beneficiaries will see lower costs. Is that an accurate representation? Why or why not? And how do you see these efforts impacting the goals of achieving and advancing health equity in the long and short term?
Here's what's so intriguing about it all. There are no metrics. The law goes into effect and nobody counts anything, right? So maybe they'll count how much money was saved, and that will be the end of it. But literally the impact on the health of the American population is not a measurement. Think about that for 2 seconds, right? You've got nearly 69 million people in a program that you are implementing, and you have no metric to decide on whether the policy that you just put in place are going to have an impact. But let's get to the positive side, because Ken, you raised something really important. There are options about money, and certainly I would advocate for every provider, servicer in the system have to prove their value. How are you impacting patient outcomes? Because that's what the system is. That's what healthcare is. That's a measurable thing. And I certainly believe that there are places in the system where there are resources to be found that can be better applied. We can have a national clinical trial infrastructure so that we lower the risk for innovation and bring innovation therapies into rural communities, into minority communities, and accelerate the advances in medicine. Europe is certainly doing that. I was in France. They're building a national database so that they can innovate, right? Why are we doing that? And at the end of the day, how is all of this affecting U.S. standings in healthcare as part of our government policy? Government talks about it wants to support industry. How is this helping do that? So there's a lot of things going on here that these laws touch upon that have not been well thought through, and they need consideration. And certainly they need data, they need analysis and feedback, because the only thing that we have in healthcare is to make sure we're taking care of the population. And I'm not sure that the systems are in place that we have right now to do that.
Nope, those are all excellent points. And in fact, the proponents that were advocating for the Inflation Reduction Act highlighting some of the higher price drugs, that somehow the negotiations on those higher price drugs, that the savings would go to patients. Well, that's not true. Any drug that's priced over essentially $8,000 per dose per year, once you hit that threshold, patients don't save a penny, because what happens is that they hit the out-of-pocket cap at $2,000. That's the real important part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So those quote-unquote higher priced drugs that get price set, all those savings go to Medicare, and none of those savings go to patients, which is, again, from our standpoint, should have been the focus of this legislation, is the impact, as you keep pointing out, on patients and patient care and incentives to innovate. So PFCD, discussions on access depend on actually having the medications for people to access. The EPIC Act would equalize the timeline for all drugs subject to Medicare pricing and set that at 13 years. Why is that adjustment so important for people making decisions on R&D investments today, for potential medicines that if they succeed, won't be available for 10 years or more?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on that like a moment ago with the various indications and where R&D may be pivoting. I think that bigger picture, this year one of negotiation is just so pivotal, right? Like investors, companies, entrepreneurs are all really watching how it all goes, if you will, to project what the out years will look like. Because what we don't know, for instance, is if Xarelto or Eliquis are going to be compared to warfarin, right? Or are they going to be compared to each other when we see the prices around September 1st of this year? So, as far as companies, yes, they're looking at their pipelines, they're looking at their investments, they want to mitigate risk. But I think we're still a little bit in the learning phases here. I would say bigger picture on negotiation, the biggest impacts are kind of 28, 29, 2030-ish, because you have Part B drugs getting folded into the mix in 2028. And, one thing that of course could happen under some scenario is that more products get added to 10, 15, 10, 10, 15, et cetera, given the savings to the program. So I point out that risk as well. Of course, there would have to be likely a certain makeup of Congress and the White House for that to happen.
I just want to jump in on the atrial fibrillation and warfarin and these NOAC drugs. They don't work in African Americans. Warfarin does not work. I mean, the evidence is clearly there, right? So to compare warfarin against these new anticoagulants is not a thing. It's just not a thing. And that's the point I'm making. And even more importantly, CMS is not built to make that kind of judgment. They don't have the staff, the team, the analytics to make those kind of comparisons, right? Certainly, if you're just doing prices, warfarin is cheap. It's a 1950s drug, so it's cheap. You can use it. But the question is, and it's difficult to use, right? It's extremely difficult to use. And the data is very, very clear that African Americans do not fare well on the medication. And that's the point I've been making. When you go across the board and you actually start to look at the science, the details of what is going to happen to patients when you put these rules in place, you find out that maybe it works for some and maybe it doesn't work for others. And that's the problem. And you reduce the choice of the clinician, because the clinician at the end of the day goes, okay, you want me to give a warfarin? I'm giving them warfarin. I'm going to send them to an INR clinic every week to get tested. And so that's a clear example of the problems that the system is opening up when it is really not doing science. It's not doing evidence-based medicine, but really talking about money.
No, those are good points, and that raises an important issue and perhaps a topic for another webinar on approaches that plans take to restrict access to medications. As you point out, there's not an average patient. Patients respond differently to different medications. And that's the beauty of the science that's developing with pharmacogenomics, where we're better able to match people based on their underlying genetics to medications that are at first dose going to be the most effective, rather than sort of taking the average patient notion of this and march people through different treatment protocols until something succeeds. Well, that should have been done in the first place right off the bat, and we have the science and technology to do that. So this is going to throw this open to everybody. What concerns you the most if the reforms in the EPIC Act are not adopted? Anybody?
I would just throw out, I think, the potential for reducing the pipeline. The pipeline for schizophrenia and other forms of severe mental illness, brain illnesses, is not as large as we'd like it to be. And as others in the industry know, there has been a rotation cycle where many companies migrated out. There's more coming in. We want to see as many comers come back in and stay in as possible because of the overall unmet needs of this community. So any barrier that exists is going to have a profound impact on the individual, on the family, and then on our society at large.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I think that if you look at the surveys out there of pharma execs and others on where the investment dollars are going to flow between small molecule drugs and biologics, they're going to migrate away from small molecule drugs. As Ipsita noted, most of the revenue that you get to recoup the investment that you made in getting the drug to market really there's 9 to 13 or so, 9 to 14. That's a real problem for small molecules. And again, as I opened up with, it's just simply reflected in how the venture capital community is looking at this legislation. To the extent that those dollars really continue to go down and dry up, the money available for innovation and investment is going to continue to be lower and lower. So I think the EPIC Act on that issue of equalizing small molecules and biologics is critically important. I'm not quite sure why the Congress would want to come up and provide financial incentives to redirect resources towards one class of medications and away from another class of medications. So scientifically, as we've been talking about, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So any other thoughts on this?
Ken, I'm sorry. I just want to say I'll let Ipsita go, and then we have some audience questions.
All right, terrific. Thank you.
I mean, I was gonna just pipe in and, not to be like the skunk at the garden party, but, these bills are likely not gonna move this year, right? And let's be honest, and it's gonna depend on what the scores are. So, maybe it's not everybody at 13 and maybe it's like, well, let's all meet at 11, so I just put that out there as far as the outlook for this issue, apart from whether it's needed or not.
It's always unfortunate to have a dose of reality thrown in, but we'll be out there advocating very strongly for it for the rest of the year and until it's really passed, because I think, as you've heard from all of our stakeholders here, it's really critically important in terms of what patients are going to get access to 5, 10, 15 years from now to manage and treat and prevent these chronic healthcare conditions. So Candace, let's go to some of the questions from the audience.
Sure. And if others have questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A function. One comment, one question dealt with the international level. And are we looking at this, or can you talk about it a little bit with an international lens as well? Because small molecules are vital in place of biologics in the developing world in particular, where biologics are largely inaccessible. You know, they're expensive, they're complicated to ship and manufacture, can often require temperature control that may not be available everywhere. So if our speakers could speak to that, Sita, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to start?
I mean, I was just agreeing with those, the premise of the question, I suppose, but, you know, at this point, sure, you know, I think there's this question of how does negotiation and these new prices in year 1, 2, 3 impact commercial insurers? Will they decide to say, well, hey, you know, Medicare's paying that, so we should pay this, you know, and then does that ripple effect just carry forward? I mean, most manufacturers market in the launch in the US first. That's where you get your, you know, best pricing and so forth, before going to Europe and other first world countries. You know, those are just some thoughts in no particular order.
You know, America has been driving the medical revolution globally, and we are living in a medical revolution if you think about it for half a second. You just look at the rates of cardiovascular disease, HIV, hepatitis C, the explosion in cancer, where we have real opportunities to do dramatic things in cancer. And in fact, the president has a cancer moonshot in which he says over the next 25 years, he wants to reduce cancer mortalities by 50%. And those have global implications because the research and technology developed here, we export to other countries. And the question is, do we want to give that up? Is that the plan? Sometimes you live so good, you don't understand what bad looks like, right? And I think that's the challenge here. We're not being smart. We're being quick to the draw, but we're not being smart. And the thing about medicine is that it's all about the science. There's no side door here. It's always about the science. And public policy has to be evidence-based. You can't get a bunch of staffers up on the Hill to decide healthcare policy. And I just want to put a little knock on CBO scoring in healthcare. I don't know who dreamt that up, but they got to cut it out. I'm sorry. CBO scoring in healthcare makes no sense to anybody who is anybody involved in healthcare. It may have made sense when you're looking at the price of steel or whatever it is you want to buy for DOD, but in healthcare, we got to cut out CBO scoring. So my point is that the rest of the world looks to America in being at the front line in the development of new medicines and new technologies. And we should want that. We should want to help, both in terms of the sheer humanity of it and the business reasons for it. You know, I guess I've said it enough times here that I'm always a little confused at the inconsistency, the unstructuredness, the lack of intentionality, whatever you want to call it, that is driving decision-making in healthcare. It is not a good thing. It is putting people's lives at risk, and we got to figure out some way to cut it out.
Gary, one of our audience questions, or actually two of them, are directly related to that. And Gordon, I'm going to look to you because one of them relates to schizophrenia. And Gary, you just hit on this. You talk about the challenges with the wrong focus, really, when it comes to scoring and healthcare costs and looking at minimizing financial risk. For example, with schizophrenia, a lot of the costs are outside the medical system. It's homelessness, it's the caregiving responsibility, even corrections, premature death. So one of the questions was, how can we redirect the conversation to understanding that broader impact? And a related one is, how do we get across this message of the importance of equitable biomedical innovation for improving health when so many people without a chronic illness or rare disease believe that lowering prices are the best healthcare solution and are driving some of this policy discussion. Gordon, can we start with you?
So our organization about a year and a half did a total economic impact study on the cost of schizophrenia in the United States. We're in the process of updating that. And if you look at that total pie of expenses in the United States, you would think that it would be Health and Human Services that would have the largest piece, but it's not. It's the Justice Department. It's because the criminal justice system for our community is largely, and in our opinion, inappropriately, charged with the medical interventions for people living with schizophrenia. That's just fundamentally wrong. So Gary said earlier that it's all about the science, and you're right, but it's also about our will. Like, what is our society's will to accept or tolerate these marginal or negative outcomes? There's a better path forward, and that requires stronger will. It requires stronger science, stronger innovation, and less barriers that are in the way so that people can get those outcomes so that they can live in the way that they deserve and respectfully deserve.
Yeah, Candace, I was just going to add on those interactions. I think, unfortunately, on the scoring side, CBO and others just view savings or costs in silos, just looking at spending in the pharmaceutical industry. What they miss, that's, again, a piece of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that by reducing out-of-pocket costs to patients for medications, the adherence rates go up, fill and refill rates are higher, and for many of these conditions, as a result, you have lower rates of hospitalizations, ER visits, ambulance rides, outpatient clinic visits, and so on. There are interactions between these sectors that don't get taken into account when these actions are scored. We have a lot of empirical evidence showing lower out-of-pocket costs, higher adherence rates, and the impact that it has on per person spending, which really should be the focus, not just sort of what we're spending in one silo of care. Actions are critically important because medications are essential in managing many of these conditions that we've been talking about today.
Thank you so much. I think we've got about 2 minutes for parting thoughts, Ken and others.
I just want to underscore what Gordon said. While I will always say the science is important, but political will is probably the most important, because without that, we can't apply the science where it needs to be. And so the political will is absolutely important, challenged by the fact that oftentimes when we have these healthcare conversations, we're really thinking about how much do I want to pay for my neighbor's healthcare? We know what we want to pay for our healthcare, but what do I want to pay for my neighbors? Losing sight of the fact that it is the same thing. It is absolutely the same thing. And so getting us towards that political will, I think that's the challenge. That's the most difficult step forward that's in front of us. And I don't know how we get there, but I think that's the journey that we have to do in order to get these things correct.
Well, I'll just end on saying how important I think it is to get the EPIC Act passed as soon as possible, whether the political realities are somewhat grim for this year, perhaps. But the longer we wait with this, the worse it's going to have in terms of patient impacts. If we wait 3, 4, or 5 years and really redirect money away from these small molecule drugs towards biologics, interestingly enough, it could have sort of an unintended effect since the small molecule drugs are less expensive, handier to use. Biologics are complicated, more expensive. So if we're redirecting by public policy investment flows into higher cost biologics and away from small molecule drugs, that doesn't seem to be a real logical outcome to me. So I don't think that the Congress should be in the business of providing financial incentives for different types of medications as part of legislation. So I think it's really critical that we adopt this and equalize the time period that they're not subject to Medicare price negotiations. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close. It's the 3 o'clock time period. It's been a really engaging hour, some terrific insights, great panel. I want to thank the panelists for participating. I really want to thank those of you who joined our webinar for sticking with us and sending in some of those outstanding questions. We at PFCD, and I know our panelists as well, will continue to advocate and fight as hard as we can to see that the EPIC Act is improved. So thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to you joining our next webinar.